All right, my friends, welcome back to another V-Rising video. This is going to be part 2 in my things that I want to see in V-Rising series. Last time we talked about the map and the things I wanted to see that were changed there. And this time around, we are going to be talking about gameplay. So first things first, one of the things that I have seen asked about and requested literally since the game came out, that I am right there with you guys, is events happening around the map. Now we do have incursion events that are going on in Mortium now. That's not exactly the same thing that we are talking about. So my personal idea for this that I think would be really cool is something similar to the Blood Moon cycle. This essentially would be events that happen periodically. It could be things like maybe like an NPC invasion event or like a siege on your castle, or maybe even just outbreaks. So my personal thought would be kind of cool would be like cull the outbreak of a certain faction around the map, where, for instance, maybe there are bandits that infiltrate Farbane in certain locations, more bandits than usual, and if you don't kill them all, then you will risk an invasion or even a castle siege, depending on your castle heart level. I think that would be really cool. And the same thing would go into Dunley and on to Gloomrot and all the way up from tier 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 castle hearts. So I think that'd be super cool if there was some kind of event system like that, where essentially if you don't cull the outbreaks and you don't kill enough guys, depending on your castle heart level, if you can participate in that event, then you will get like attacked. You'll have like a castle siege by these guys or by the NPCs. I think that'd be super cool. Obviously that'd be some kind of limit because you wouldn't want them to like raid you when you're offline or something. That would be absolutely awful. But honestly, I think that would be one of the coolest things. One thing I think would be great is if maybe you had like some kind of mechanism you could turn on that says, I would like to participate in these events. So we have like the Eye of Mortium where it shows you when incursion events are happening. So something like that that you can kind of activate and say, hey, I want to know whenever there's like an outbreak that's happening so I can go cull it, fight it. And then obviously if you log off, you won't have anything to worry about. But if you're logged in and that thing is active, then you better be watching out because otherwise your castle could get invaded. Another thing that could happen is roaming world bosses. So obviously like the normal bosses are already roaming around the world. Someone like Simon Belmont is already roaming the map, which is super cool. He is kind of like a world boss to me. However, two things. One, Simon Belmont should drop more loot. I don't get why he doesn't. He needs to drop more. And two, I mean more like a roaming world boss event where maybe it's marked on the map. And if you go and kill it, it's like a loot pinata rather than a unlocking a spell. Think like a really, really rare carriage that's announced on the map and it really fights back. And not just like, you know, the little mobs, but it actually fights back and it's very difficult. I think that would be amazing. Next thing I would love to see is more legendaries introduced to the game. A perfect example of legendaries that I think are the right direction to go. Obviously, you don't have to listen to me. This is just my opinion. But I think the perfect direction would be something kind of like Apocalypse or Hand of Winter, and how they kind of like cast spells or interact with certain infusions in really cool ways. I think that is the right way to approach legendaries. I think it's a really good way to approach legendaries. Obviously, not the right way specifically, maybe just a really good way to approach them, because it really makes it feel like you are enabling some kind of playstyle. That's the thing that they're really focusing on with the 1.1 update. They really want to enable some kind of playstyle. So to me, if you want to enable playstyle, weapons are a huge part of that, not just stats, but specifically legendaries that are focused on a task. So maybe not necessarily something like Oak Song or Thousand Storms, which is really just kind of like, I do the damage, you know, or whatever. Like I do static damage on my spear. I mean, I love those weapons, or I love Thousand Storms. Oak Song, I think needs a lot of love, but Thousand Storms I love. It's a great weapon, but also it's also kind of just one-dimensional. You know, Spider-Man's pretty cool. But just spear Q do static is kind of like, okay, well, great, but also, huh? So I think things like Hand of Winter or Apocalypse, where you're like casting spells with them, are really cool. Like I said, I think it would enable those playstyles. And I think one thing you could do with that would be actually really interesting to make it so they could really lean into that idea is limit the number of legendaries that you can use on your hotbar at one time. So similar to how like the upcoming passive system is changing, where we're only going to be able to pick a certain number of passives, do the same thing with the legendary artifact weapons, where you can only pick like 2 of them or something. And then the other weapons on your hotbar would be more so like your support like other weapons or support weapons, kind of how they are now. But the legendary specifically, what that would do is it would allow them to really lean into how they make those weapons work. So you can actually be like, I want to be like a blood casting like vampire. So my weapons are going to be these crazy legendary blood legendaries that just do crazy blood effects, right? Maybe some heals or whatever it may be. And then with that, as you obviously, if you introduce too many legendaries, eventually it gets to the point that the RNG at the Mortium Trader becomes a little bit too much. So to me, what I think they should do is introduce roaming traders back onto the map. Once upon a time, in the early access version of the game, before there were shady dealers or the Dunley Farmers Market, there were actually roaming traders that walked around the map. Gavin, the shady dealer, Burke, the wandering trader, and I think it was Otar, the merchant in Silverlight. He didn't roam in Brighthaven. He didn't roam, but he was pretty cool. I think they should introduce more of those that roam around the map and maybe make it so we can trade for. They have a rotating stock of legendary artifact weapons, and you can use greater Stygian shards or onyx tiers to buy them. I think that would be super cool, and it would make it really cool to like hunt them down and find them so you can get your, your preferred weapons. Speaking of weapons, I think that more weapons is probably going to be a good thing. Some people might disagree with me, but personally, I love the idea of more weapons, and I think there are so many options that they can do for that. So, for instance, one thing I think would be kind of interesting would be maybe like a spell staff that they could explore, where you could slot in 2 additional offensive spells with no jewels, but offensive spells into the staff itself. And you could maybe cast spells from your staff so you could have like more offensive spells. So obviously it would share cooldown with your weapon skills. And I think that might open up some very interesting offensive spells possibilities. Really just the builds you could do with that be totally crazy. Although balance would definitely be an issue, have to be looked at a lot there. I'm not really sure what that balance would look like, but it would be cool to be able to explore that possibility. Another thing I think would be cool would be something like a shield weapon that could function somewhat similarly to like Frost or Chaos Barrier or Ward of the Damned, but instead be on a weapon. Obviously, that's probably totally crazy. You'd have to really make sure it's not stupidly overpowered because you could just have so much defense that it'd be really rough. But the counter to that is, we've talked about this in another video before, the counter to that would be to make it so offensive spells and maybe some other weapons actually have a chance against defensive abilities. That would be pretty cool. And finally, while the whip was at the top of, like, just a whip in general was at the top of my list for this game, something I've wanted for a very long time, something that was right there with that is the rapier. We actually had a rapier leaked at one point in the Gloomrot patch, but I would love a rapier with like a precision timed parry riposte ability. I think that would be so cool. Honestly, there's so much room and such a huge list of weapons that you could add to this game, but I would love to see a bunch of them. So the next thing I would like to talk about is a siege overhaul. Honestly, I think that's one of the biggest things PvP needs at the moment. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you other fellow PvP guys disagree with me on this, but personally, I think they could change so much here. I think it needs it, and I think it could be so much better than it is currently. So something I think that would be nice is really just making it more engaging for both the attackers and defenders in terms of like siege mechanics, and not just me get golem, me hit wall break, me use key on heart, me win. Right? Or me kill golem, me win. So I would love something more than that. For instance, like more siege engines for the attacker side. Like imagine if you had some kind of like cannons or like a catapult or something that could attack from up to a certain distance. And maybe it has to be placed outside of the castle territory, which forces defenders to like send something out to come like stop them. And maybe it also could attack up to like higher tiers of castle, so that like people can't just like build their castle on a second tier and just leave their bottom tier blank and just not have to deal with the siege engines. I don't know, something like that might be interesting to explore to see how that feels. Another thing could be like ghoul or skeleton summoning circles that would attack the base as like NPC waves just going to the base to attack it and slowly break the walls. And maybe some form of like rat form interaction that could be used as like a go deep like scouting tool. Or maybe like you can go into certain rooms and then come back out unless they're blocked by a certain type of defensive like wall or something. Or maybe instead like a bat or something that could fly around inside the base and scout inside the castle that you can like look through its eyes and see what it's seeing to get an idea about what you're dealing with. And then on the defensive side, I'm thinking more defensive options. So the devs originally did not intend or really mean or predict that we would be using banshees, blood golems, mutated rats, and all those types of things for base defense. Like originally, that was not something they meant to. I don't think they really saw that coming. Once upon a time, actually, there were some more insane people that would honeycomb their bases with werewolves back whenever the werewolf workers would break out of their cages, out of the prison cells whenever the sun would go down and like the night would come. They would break out of their prison cells and just be roaming inside of the honeycomb. So once upon a time that used to happen. It was a hilarious thing people would try to do, but yeah, that was the thing that used to happen. And while I personally, I love this kind of creativity, I love to see that, but I just think that defenses is just so like intended defenses in this game are really just lacking. So maybe something like traps inside the castle that would make enemies think twice before just waltzing into our dark domain, right? Or maybe something like statues, all the cool statues we can build, will make them do something that matters. Maybe they come to our aid and fight back against the siege engines. Or maybe they give us like information or warnings beforehand to know like, hey, there's somebody outside your castle, watch out, or whatever. You know, there's so many cool things like that that you can make them do. I would love to see something like that. I believe I was talking to GrimXV about this specifically. I think that was his idea, was have the gargoyles be like a warning system outside your base that would just like tell you, hey, there's someone outside your castle. There's so many little, or like a camera you could use from like a long way away. You just press map and like click on your base and look through, like have a little window that pops up and says, hey, look, there's people outside your base. Something like that would be kind of cool. Really, another thing I would love to see for sieges is a way to incentivize less honeycomb and more cool looking castles. So one way you could do this would be to introduce new wall options that would have more or less HP depending on the durability of the things that you're using. So right now there's just wood or stone. I think that would be cool to have better stuff than that, but also the stronger things would require a minimum number of flooring inside of each room. So for example, like the current stone walls could just stay like a 1x1, but maybe reinforced stone would use like iron and brick and would have more HP than stone walls, but would have to be like a 2x2 floor minimum. And then maybe silver reinforced would be even more HP than that, but it would require a 4x4 flooring minimum or something along those lines, where you could have stronger walls and then just get rid of the siege mechanic entirely, or like the breach mechanic, where you just like, instead you're just busting through walls. And while the castle's under attack, they can't repair it, etc., etc. The actual breach thing, where you're like suddenly doing more damage, make it so like you actually just have, you have to use more materials to make a stronger or weaker castle. I don't know, stuff like that would be kind of cool to explore. Obviously there's a lot of balancing issues there, but that would be something I would love to see. And finally, in terms of gameplay, please stun lock. This should have been at the beginning. Please stun lock, fix Nomad runs, please and thank you. So for context, we used to be able to craft inside of enemy crafting stations, which would enable really cool and like extremely unique and interesting playstyles of trying to play through the game without ever building a base and just crafting inside of the enemy's crafting stations. And even if you weren't playing like full Nomad, it actually made it so you could like infiltrate somebody's poorly defended base if you were on a PvP server, steal their mats, and then like craft gear inside of their base. So the only thing that changed, so in 1.0, for some reason, that function of crafting was changed. You could still get inside their base, you could still steal their stuff, but you have to craft your own base and craft your own stuff. I don't know why this was changed. I could honestly give you a 30-minute speech right now off the top of my head as to why that change is overwhelmingly negative, and it doesn't actually do, if they did it on purpose, it doesn't really do anything good for the game. Like there's the negatives that it brings outweigh the positives to such a degree, and it doesn't even actually accomplish the positives in the way they might think it would. So I could go about this for like 30 minutes, but just suffice it to say, they got rid of a really, really cool mechanic that allowed for like really amazing plays. I even have a run from the Gumart patch, if you haven't seen it, where I got to the shard bosses and beat the winged horror without ever building a base. One of my favorite runs I've ever done, and that was one of my favorite playstyles, and it was sadly just removed from the game in 1.0. But anyway, that is going to be it for part 2, and we're going to end this off. The next part will be talking about content, as well as my white whale wishes, the things that will probably never be added to the game, but I would love to see them nonetheless. But anyway, that is going to be it. If you enjoyed this, let me know down below what kind of gameplay changes you would like to see, and feel free to like the video if you enjoyed this, and subscribe if you like this type of content. But anyway, that's going to be it. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next one.